Hello, we're back to talk more about medical record auditing, specifically auditing the medical office record. Okay, again, we're going to be talking about auditing the medical record. Chapter 9 gives you a little bit of background about the audit tools and some of the other things that are used. Chapter 10 are cases, which you'll be able to do. And we'll talk about the different tools, the reference materials. We'll talk about problems and deficiencies. And most importantly is the next to the last bullet point, the 7 steps of the auditing process. Chapter 10, you'll be doing the audit exercises, but what's mentioned in this slide deck as well. There are 2 different ways to perform a medical record chart audit. And again, this comes down to audit tools. More and more software programs are coming up. There are different companies that will sell these to you. Some larger organizations will make their own. Oracle has a product out for doing medical record software audits. But whether you're using paper tools or using electronic tools that are developed by a software company, the basic premise is the same. Ideally, if you're working with a developer to develop an audit tool, you're working with somebody who has knowledge of health information practices, coding, and what types of fields and order of the fields you need for these tools. Nearly all of these audit tools or software programs, if you're using that, will have space for comments, right? It's not enough to say that something doesn't have this, that, or the other thing. I want to see a narrative of why. When a procedure is performed, in addition to the E&M servicing, most auditing software does not have a mechanism for auditing services. Some don't even have a way to mark down modifier 25. So again, these are the things where you as a health information management professional can offer guidance to developers when they write these types of software programs. And again, for certain situations, we still use paper audit forms. And again, these are especially useful with new auditors if you're training them, so you can go back and show them where they went wrong on something. A little bit easier and more practical to do on a paper form than an electronic form. And the 7 steps that we mentioned earlier. Most importantly, get familiar with the audit tools. Normally we write these in instructions, so they'll be very explicit about how you put the data on the tool, right? And this lines up with some things that you've learned about with data dictionaries, the address, the date of service, everything has to be in a particular order. You want to have all your reference materials. If you're fortunate enough to be using 3M Encoder, they're all in one place. You have AHA, Coding Clinic, you have all your CPT materials, everything is integrated, right? And then you perform the chart audit, right? So you're collecting the data, as you will be doing with those cases in chapter 10. Next, you'll be doing the review analysis. And this is where ability with spreadsheets is extremely useful. And more hospitals are relying and expecting on health information management personnel to be able to put these things in a spreadsheet and write some basic reports, display information in a graph, and do all these other things. The 5th step is to meet with the provider, and this is critical to give the provider meaningful feedback. And that kind of leads into 6, which is make recommendations for improvement. In other words, looking at these things, where are we going wrong? right? Could be something just as simple as they're not documenting the time spent with the patient. It could be any other types of things. And then finally, we want to provide meaningful monitoring and guidance. We want to be able to give these people guidance to enable them to correct their errors. And the only way you're going to know if there's any improvement is by auditing and doing some continuing monitoring and guidance. So again, when you get into doing these office records, it's the compliance medical group, right? And again, you want to be able to make the recommendations to the providers as they talk about here. And again, even though more and more practices may be going to time-based with the new guidelines, for the purposes of this chapter, it's still a good discipline to go through the history, the physical exam, and the medical decision-making. So we can't code something without a chief complaint, and you would be surprised at the number of times that we don't have a chief complaint. We have the history of the present illness, review of systems, past medical history, and expanded problem focus history if it's called for. And then we have the exam, right? I want to be able to have the documentation guidelines, right? And once we hit the 6 elements in the 97 guidelines, it's an expanded problem focus exam. Then finally, we have the medical decision making. So we want to look at how many things are being asked to consider. What do they have to review in terms of tests? All these other things that you learned about in CPT. And medical decision making, this is one reason why some people really don't especially care for E&M. There is a certain amount of wiggle room. Some auditors use the point system that are developed by Marshfield Clinic. Some look at the number of things that are marked off. They have specialized forms and all these things. But you need to be able to analyze the medical decision making in a couple of different ways and look at what drives it from being simple to complex. Each encounter has to stand on its own. And what that means is we don't, as some providers will do, kind of borrow things from that may or may not be pertinent and kind of perpetuate it into the encounter. We have to have an assessment or clinical impression or diagnosis for that encounter. And it may be explicitly stated, it may be implied in terms of this, but we should code anything that's affecting the care plan or requiring further evaluation, referral, or what have you. And again, when we talk about medical decision-making, morbidity, mortality, risk, amounts of data, different diagnostic tests to consider, all those things come into play. And again, I think this may have been mentioned earlier, but a lot of times providers will just automatically assume that if somebody has a certain condition, COPD is one that comes to mind, that they're automatically going to be level 4. They're going to be 99204, 99214, and that may or may not be the case. And again, what we want to do, the goal of auditing the medical record is not to find fault with the practitioner. We want to identify problem areas so we can code more accurately and ensure that we're submitting correct codes that allow for correct reimbursement, right? It's not to be critical of what the providers are doing, right? So we want to look at certain problem areas. And a lot of times this can run into different things, say like major depression. When I was working in ambulatory Medicare finance, this was a big reimbursable HCC. So of course, within Kaiser, they were putting on the drive to have everybody do a PHQ-9, evaluate Medicare patients for depression, right? And again, didn't always work out well. So the idea was to audit the medical records. And if they did in fact have it, we should code it. But just to say that they were given a screening and therefore they had depression and therefore it's major depression's a huge leap of faith that wasn't always supported by the documentation. And that's all I have for you. We'll see you online. Bye now.